Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you tales that touch the heart and inspire the soul. In today's story, we follow Ella, a forgotten princess overshadowed by her family, as she embarks on a journey of self-discovery, courage, and love. From the shadows of rejection to the light of acceptance, Ella's resilience and compassion shine through as she finds her voice and learns what it truly means to be seen and loved. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories and hit the notification bell to join us for this unforgettable tale. Let's begin today's story together. Ella had always felt like a shadow in her own home. The grand palace where she lived was filled with light and laughter. But for her, it was a place of cold whispers and distant gazes. Her sisters, Ivy and Lila, were everything a princess was expected to be: beautiful, poised, and adored by all. Their mother, Queen Eleanor, would dote on them endlessly, her eyes sparkling with pride as they danced, laughed, and charmed everyone in sight. But when it came to Ella, the Queen's gaze would falter, clouded with disappointment and something Ella could only describe as sorrow. From a young age, Ella knew she was different. She could see it in the way people looked at her, their smiles faltering, their eyes shifting uneasily. Her face was not like her sisters' with their delicate features and glowing complexions. Her eyes, though large and expressive, were set wide apart. Her nose was broader, her lips twisted into a shape that felt foreign even to her. Her father, King Henry, rarely spoke to her, preferring the company of his other daughters, who fit the ideal image of royalty. And so, Ella found solace in the woods beyond the palace grounds. It was forbidden for her to go there, her mother having once declared it too wild and unseemly for a princess. But Ella was drawn to the quiet, to the rustling leaves and the gentle murmur of the creek that wound its way through the forest. Here, she felt the judgment of the palace melt away, replaced by the soft acceptance of nature. One day, when she was just 6 years old, Ella ventured further into the forest than ever before. She had been watching her sisters and their friends play near the edge of the palace gardens, their laughter ringing out like music. Hidden behind a large oak tree, she had longed to join them, but she knew better than to try. Instead, when they disappeared toward the creek, Ella followed at a distance, curiosity tugging at her. The creek was a sight to behold, its surface like a polished mirror reflecting the endless blue sky. Ella stayed hidden behind a thick bush, watching as her sisters splashed and played in the shallow water. The maids filled their pots, laughing and chatting, their voices blending with the sounds of the stream. Ella had never been this close before, and her heart raced with a mix of fear and excitement. When the others left, Ella edged closer to the water, her small hands trembling as she leaned over to see her reflection for the first time. What she saw made her gasp and stumble backward. The face staring back at her was not one she recognized. It wasn't like her sister's or her mother's. It was strange and unfamiliar, her eyes wide with a sadness she didn't understand. For a moment, she thought it was some creature lurking beneath the surface, waiting to pull her in. A scream tore from her throat, and she turned and ran, her small legs carrying her as fast as they could back to the palace. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her chest heaving as she collapsed behind the safety of the high walls. But the face from the creek stayed with her, haunting her dreams and shadowing her waking thoughts. It wasn't until she overheard the maids gossiping that Ella learned the truth. The face in the water had been her own. It was her reflection she had seen for the first time. And now she understood why people looked at her the way they did. Why her sisters always pulled away when she tried to join their games. Why even her mother's eyes would linger on her with that strange, pained expression before quickly looking away. Ella stopped trying after that. She stopped reaching out, stopped hoping for inclusion or affection. Instead, she retreated further into herself, becoming a quiet observer of life. The woods became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the harsh eyes of the world and lose herself in the gentle embrace of nature. Years passed, and Ella grew into a young woman. The loneliness that had once been a weight around her shoulders became a part of her. Like the air she breathed. She no longer flinched at the whispered comments or the averted gazes. She had learned to endure, to find strength in her solitude. And in the woods, she discovered something she had never shared with anyone, her voice. It started one day when she was sitting on a moss-covered rock, her back resting against the trunk of a towering oak. The forest was alive with its usual symphony of rustling leaves and chirping birds. But Ella's heart was heavy with a longing she couldn't name. Without thinking, she began to hum. The notes soft and tentative at first, but growing stronger as the melody took shape. The birds stopped their chatter, their heads tilting as if to listen. The squirrels paused in their scurrying, their tiny eyes fixed on her. Even the trees seemed to sway gently in rhythm with her song. Ella's voice floated through the forest, clear and pure, carrying with it the depth of her emotions, the loneliness, the longing, the fragile hope she kept buried deep within her. For the first time, Ella felt truly free. Her voice was a part of her that no one could take away, a gift she didn't fully understand but cherished nonetheless. It became her secret, something she shared only with the forest and its creatures. But the woods, for all their comfort, could not shield her from the world forever. One fateful day, as Ella sat by the creek, her voice weaving through the trees in a haunting melody, a scream shattered the stillness. It was faint at first, almost too soft to be real, but it came again, louder and more desperate. Ella froze, her heart pounding. The forest, her sanctuary, suddenly felt strange and ominous. But something stirred within her, a memory of her own fear and loneliness. And she knew she couldn't ignore the sound. She followed the screams, her bare feet silent on the forest floor, until she came upon a small clearing. There, caught in a crude hunter's trap, was a young man. His leg was ensnared, the ropes cutting into his skin, and his face was twisted in pain. He wore fine clothes, the kind only someone of importance could afford. And despite his disheveled state, there was an air of nobility about him. Ella hesitated at the edge of the clearing, fear and uncertainty gripping her. She had never been this close to a stranger before, let alone one who looked so finely dressed and so handsome. Her first instinct was to run, to flee back into the safety of the trees. But then she saw the desperation in his eyes, the way he clawed at the trap with trembling hands, and her heart ached with a familiar pain. Steeling herself, Ella stepped forward. Her voice was soft but steady as she said, "Please, don't move. I'm here to help." The young man's eyes snapped open, and he looked at her with a mix of surprise and relief. "Who are you?" he gasped, wincing as another wave of pain shot through his leg. "My name is Ella," she replied, kneeling beside him. "Hold still. I'll try to free you." And as her hands worked to loosen the knots, Ella couldn't help but feel that her life, so long defined by isolation and rejection, was about to change forever. Ella's fingers worked quickly, loosening the knots of the trap that held the young man captive. The ropes were thick and tightly wound, clearly designed to hold even the strongest of creatures. She had seen similar traps before during her wanderings in the forest, always careful to avoid them. This one was no different, a crude but effective mechanism. As her hands moved, her mind raced. "Who are you?" the man asked again, his voice softer this time but laced with pain. "My name is Ella," she replied without looking up, her focus on the task at hand. "I live nearby." "Well, not in the village, but close enough." The man studied her as she spoke, his dark eyes filled with curiosity despite the agony etched on his face. "I'm Ethan," he said after a pause, his voice steadying. "Prince Ethan of Everdale." Ella glanced at him briefly, her heart skipping a beat at the mention of his title. A prince. Of course. He was a prince. His fine clothes and commanding presence should have made that obvious. Yet, she couldn't let herself dwell on it. He was just a person in need of help, and she had to focus. You shouldn't be out here alone, she said quietly, her hands deftly loosening another knot. The forest can be dangerous. Ethan let out a strained chuckle. I've learned that the hard way. Despite herself, Ella felt a small smile tug at her lips. She kept her gaze down, not wanting him to see the heat rising in her cheeks. It wasn't often that someone spoke to her without the weight of judgment or pity in their voice. Finally, with a firm pull, the last knot came undone, and the ropes fell away. Ethan let out a breath of relief, his body sagging as the tension left him. Ella leaned back, wiping her hands on her skirt as she assessed the damage. His leg was deeply cut, the skin raw and bleeding. You'll need to stop the bleeding, she said, her voice more confident now. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress, folding it into a makeshift bandage. This will have to do until we can find proper help. As she wrapped the fabric around his wound, Ethan watched her closely. You seem to know your way around the forest, he said. Do you come here often? Ella nodded, tying the bandage tightly. It's peaceful here. It's the only place I feel free. She hesitated, unsure why she was sharing so much with a stranger, let alone a prince. Ethan tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. Free from what? Ella didn't answer. Instead, she busied herself with adjusting the bandage, hoping he wouldn't press further. But Ethan seemed to sense her reluctance and changed the subject. Thank you, he said sincerely, his voice soft. You saved me. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come. Ella looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. There was no trace of mockery or discomfort in his expression, only genuine gratitude. It was a look she wasn't used to, and it unsettled her. You should rest, she said, standing and taking a step back. I can help you to a safer spot, but then you'll need someone to tend to that properly. Ethan nodded, wincing as he tried to move his injured leg. Without a word, Ella knelt beside him, helping him to his feet. He leaned heavily on her for support, his arm draped over her shoulders as they made their way through the forest. Despite his weight, Ella felt a strange sense of purpose. For once, she wasn't the one needing help. They reached a small clearing where a fallen tree provided a place for Ethan to sit. Ella helped him down gently, her hands steady despite the fluttering in her chest. As he settled, he looked up at her with a faint smile. You're not like anyone I've met before, he said, his tone thoughtful. Ella's cheeks flushed, and she looked away. That's not necessarily a good thing, she muttered. It is to me, Ethan replied, his voice firm. The sincerity in his words caught her off guard. She had spent so long believing that her differences were a burden, something to be hidden or ignored. Yet here was someone, a prince, no less, who saw her as something more. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in golden light, Ethan leaned back against the fallen tree, his expression softening. Do you live out here alone? He asked after a moment. Ella hesitated before answering. Not exactly. I live in the palace. Ethan's brows lifted in surprise. The palace? Your royalty? She nodded, her stomach tightening. I am. But I'm not like the others. What do you mean? Ella struggled to find the words. How could she explain the years of isolation? The whispers and stares. The feeling of being an outsider even in her own family. She looked away, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. It doesn't matter, she said finally. I should get back before anyone notices I'm gone. Ethan's gaze lingered on her, a mixture of curiosity and concern in his eyes. But he didn't push. Instead, he reached out and touched her hand lightly. Thank you, Ella, he said. For everything. She nodded, pulling her hand away gently. Take care of yourself, Your Highness. Ethan, he corrected with a small smile. Just Ethan. Ella allowed herself a faint smile before turning and disappearing into the forest, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on her heart. She knew she might never see him again, but something about their meeting had left an imprint on her. As she made her way back to the palace, Her thoughts swirled with questions and emotions she couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, Ella felt seen not as the unwanted daughter or the strange princess, but as someone worthy of notice. And deep down, she wondered if the prince would remember her the way she knew she would remember him. Ella returned to the palace under the cover of night, her heart still racing from the encounter in the forest. The quiet corridors were bathed in moonlight, and her footsteps echoed faintly on the marble floors. She slipped into her chambers unnoticed, her mind heavy with the memory of Prince Ethan. She had helped him, and he had seen her, truly seen her, and for the first time, she had felt like more than just a shadow. But the glow of that moment was fleeting. By the next morning, the familiar weight of her reality returned. In the bright light of day, Ella was once again the forgotten princess, hidden in the background while her sisters basked in the admiration of the court. Ivy and Lila pranced about the grand hall, their laughter ringing out as servants scrambled to fulfill their every whim. Ella stayed in her room, staring out the window at the forest in the distance. She longed to return, to feel the serenity of the woods and perhaps, foolishly, to see Ethan again. But she knew better than to hope. A prince like him wouldn't waste his time on someone like her. She was just a momentary curiosity, a fleeting kindness. Days turned into weeks, and Ella kept her distance from the forest. But her thoughts were never far from Ethan. She remembered the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, the warmth in his voice when he thanked her. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, no matter how hard she tried. Unbeknownst to her, Ethan had been searching. He returned to the forest every day, retracing his steps and calling out her name. His men teased him, baffled by his sudden obsession with finding a nameless girl in the woods. But Ethan couldn't explain it, not to them, not even to himself. She's different, he had told his closest advisor. There's something about her, something I can't forget. His persistence finally paid off one sunny afternoon. Ella had ventured back into the forest. Unable to resist the pull of her sanctuary, she sat by the creek, her voice weaving through the trees in a soft, haunting melody. The birds gathered around her, as they always did, and the world felt peaceful again. Ethan heard her before he saw her. The sound of her singing stopped him in his tracks, the melody wrapping around him like a gentle embrace. His heart leaped, and he followed the sound carefully, not wanting to startle her. When he finally saw her, sitting on a mossy rock with the sunlight filtering through the trees, he felt his breath catch. "Ella," he called softly, stepping into the clearing. She froze, her song cutting off abruptly as she turned to face him. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice wary. "I came to find you," Ethan said simply, his tone earnest. "I wanted to thank you again. Anne. I wanted to see you." Ella's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to believe him, but years of rejection had taught her to be cautious. "You've thanked me already," she said quietly, lowering her gaze. "You didn't need to come back." "But I did," Ethan insisted, taking a step closer. "I couldn't stop thinking about you." Ella shook her head, her hands twisting in her lap. "You don't know me. I'm not like the people you're used to." "That's exactly why I'm here," Ethan said, his voice softening. "You're not like anyone I've ever met. You're kind and strong. And your voice, it's unlike anything I've ever heard. You saved me. Ella. You didn't have to. But you did." "Why?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion and something deeper, an ache she couldn't name. "Because I know what it feels like," she admitted. "To be alone. To be scared. I couldn't just leave you there." Ethan smiled. And for the first time, Ella felt the walls around her heart begin to crack. "And that's why I can't leave you alone," he said. "You're remarkable, Ella. Even if you don't see it." Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, turning her face so he wouldn't see. She didn't know what to say, how to respond to someone who looked at her the way Ethan did. You don't have to say anything, Ethan said gently, sensing her hesitation. Just let me stay for a while. I want to know you. And so they sat by the creek, the sun dipping lower in the sky as they talked. Ethan shared stories of his travels, his adventures in distant lands, and the lessons he had learned along the way. Ella listened, her laughter soft and hesitant at first, but growing as the hours passed. In return, she told him about the forest, its secrets, and the comfort it gave her. She spoke of the animals that gathered when she sang and the peace she felt when she was surrounded by nature. But she didn't speak of the palace or her family, keeping that part of her life locked away. Ethan noticed her reluctance but didn't press. He respected her boundaries, sensing that her past was a heavy burden she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he focused on the present, on the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of the woods, on the sound of her voice as it filled the clearing with warmth. By the time they parted, the sky was painted in hues of pink and gold, and Ella felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. As she walked back to the palace, she realized that Ethan had seen her in a way no one else ever had, not as the strange or forgotten princess, but as someone worthy of notice. And for the first time, she wondered if perhaps she could believe it too. The days that followed were unlike any Ella had ever known. For years, the forest had been her retreat, a place where she could escape the judgment and whispers of the palace. Now, it had become something more. Each day, she found herself drawn back to the creek, her heart racing with the possibility of seeing Ethan again. And each day, he was there, waiting for her. Their conversations grew longer, their silences more comfortable. Ethan spoke of his life as a prince, the expectations that came with his title, and the weight of responsibility he carried. He described the splendor of his kingdom, Everdale, with its bustling marketplaces, sprawling gardens, and grand castle that overlooked a shimmering lake. But beneath the surface of his words, Ella sensed a loneliness that mirrored her own. "You have everything," she said one afternoon, her voice tinged with disbelief. "How could you ever feel lonely?" Ethan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Because none of it matters if you don't have someone who truly understands you. People see the title, the wealth, but not the person." "Not really." Ella nodded, understanding more than she could express. For so long, she had felt invisible in her own home, her worth diminished by the narrow expectations of beauty and grace. But with Ethan, she felt seen, not for what she lacked, but for who she was. As their bond deepened, Ella began to let down her guard. She shared stories of her childhood, of the games she had played alone in the palace gardens, of the moments when she had longed to join her sisters but held back, knowing she would be unwelcome. She spoke of the pain of her mother's coldness and the way her father seemed to forget she existed. Ethan listened intently, his brow furrowed with empathy. "They don't see what I see," he said softly. "They don't see your strength, your kindness. They're blind to the things that truly matter." Ella smiled faintly, her heart swelling with gratitude. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. No one had ever looked past the surface to see the person beneath. But even as she cherished their moments together, a shadow of doubt lingered in her mind. Ethan was a prince, a man of importance and status. She was the forgotten daughter, the princess who had been cast aside. What could he possibly see in her? And even if he did care, what future could they possibly have? These thoughts haunted her as she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her small chamber. The palace was silent, but her mind was loud with questions and fears. She had never allowed herself to dream of more. And now that she had met Ethan, she didn't know how to stop. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in golden light, Ethan broke the silence that had fallen between them. "Ella," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I want you to come with me to Everdale." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "What?" "I want you to leave this place," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "Come with me to my kingdom. You don't belong here. Hiding in the shadows. You deserve to be somewhere you can truly be yourself. Ella's heart raced. The thought of leaving the palace, of escaping the life that had confined her for so long, was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had dreamed of freedom, but the reality of it felt overwhelming. I can't, she whispered, shaking her head. My family. Your family doesn't see you for who you are. Ethan interrupted gently. But I do. Ella. You've given me something I never thought I'd find. You've shown me what it means to be truly seen, to be understood. I want to give you the same. Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned away, her hands trembling. It's not that simple, she said. You don't know them. They wouldn't let me go. Then I'll speak to them. Ethan said firmly, I'll make them understand. Ella. I don't want to lose you. His words sent a wave of warmth through her, but they also filled her with fear. She had spent her life protecting herself, hiding her pain and her hopes to avoid the sting of rejection. Letting Ethan fight for her meant opening herself up to possibilities she wasn't sure she could handle. I need time, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to think. Ethan nodded, his expression softening. Take all the time you need, he said. But know this, I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here, waiting for you, for as long as it takes. Ella looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of his sincerity. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the future he saw for them. But years of loneliness had taught her to be cautious, and she couldn't let herself hope too quickly. That night, as she walked back to the palace, the forest seemed quieter than usual. The shadows stretched long and dark, and the weight of her decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had always thought of herself as small, insignificant. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she was capable of something more. The palace loomed large in the moonlight as Ella returned from the forest, her steps slow and heavy with uncertainty. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, offering a future she had never dared imagine. But for all her longing, Ella couldn't ignore the fear rooted deep within her heart, a fear that the world, with its cruel expectations, would never allow her to find happiness. The following morning, the quiet hum of the palace was disrupted by Ivy and Lila. They had caught wind of Ella's frequent trips to the forest, their maids whispering about her secretive disappearances. While Ella had always tried to stay unnoticed, her sister's curiosity had been piqued, fueled by their need to maintain dominance in the family's social hierarchy. I wonder what she's been up to, Ivy said with a sly smirk as she adjusted the intricate folds of her gown. Maybe she's found a tree to talk to, or perhaps a squirrel to sing to. That's all she's good for. Lila giggled, her voice sharp. It's probably better than her trying to talk to people. Can you imagine? She feigned a look of horror. They'd run in terror. Their laughter rang out through the corridors. But Ella, hidden just beyond the corner, didn't flinch. She had grown used to their barbs, each one sliding over the walls she had built around herself. Still, today their words felt heavier. If they knew about Ethan, if they discovered he was meeting her in the forest, she knew they would stop at nothing to ruin it. The thought sent a chill down her spine, and she resolved to be more cautious. She would have to find another way to see Ethan, away from the prying eyes of the palace. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. That afternoon, Ella was summoned to the great hall. Her heart sank as she stepped inside and found her father, King Henry, seated at the head of the room, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood Ivy and Lila, their faces alight with smug satisfaction. Queen Eleanor sat to his right, her gaze cold and piercing. You called for me, father? Ella asked, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her chest. King Henry motioned for her to step closer. Ella, your sisters have brought something to my attention. They claim you've been meeting a man in the forest. A prince. No less. Is this true? Ella's breath caught. Her hands trembled at her sides. But she forced herself to remain composed. She glanced at Ivy and Lila, their eyes gleaming with triumph. And then back to her father. Yes, she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It's true. The Queen's lips curled into a sneer. How utterly inappropriate. You've been sneaking around, shaming this family with your actions. I've done nothing shameful, Ella said, a flicker of defiance rising within her. I helped someone in need. Helped? Ivy scoffed. Don't flatter yourself. He probably doesn't even know who you are. What could a prince possibly want with you? The words stung. But Ella held her ground. He's my friend, she said firmly. And he sees me for who I am. King Henry leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. Who is this prince? His name is Ethan. Ella replied, meeting her father's gaze. He is the Prince of Everdale. At the mention of Ethan's name, the room shifted. The Queen stiffened. And the smug looks on Ivy and Lila's faces faltered. Everdale was a powerful kingdom, its alliance highly coveted. The idea that Prince Ethan might take an interest in Ella, a daughter they had dismissed for years, seemed impossible. Ethan of Everdale? King Henry repeated, his voice tinged with curiosity. And he spends time with you? Ella nodded. Yes. Father. He comes to the forest to see me. For a moment. The room was silent. Then, to Ella's astonishment, her father smiled. Well, this is unexpected, he said. If what you say is true, it could be of great benefit to our kingdom. Queen Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Benefit? Surely you're not suggesting. I am. King Henry interrupted, his tone firm. If Prince Ethan is interested in Ella, we must support it. This could strengthen our ties with Everdale. Ivy and Lila exchanged panicked glances, their plan to humiliate Ella unraveling before their eyes. But father, Ivy protested. This is absurd. Ella isn't, she's not. She is a princess of this kingdom. King Henry said sharply, cutting her off. And if Prince Ethan sees her worth, then so should we. Ella stood frozen, her mind racing. 4 years. She had been ignored, dismissed. And now, suddenly, her father was looking at her as though she mattered. But his interest wasn't born of love or newfound respect. It was a calculation. A strategy to secure an alliance. The realization left her cold. As the king rose from his throne, he gestured for the servants to begin preparations. Send word to Everdale, he instructed. We will invite Prince Ethan to the palace. Ella's heart sank. The thought of Ethan walking into this place, of being dragged into the cold, calculating world of her family, filled her with dread. She had wanted him to see her as more than her title. But now, that very title threatened to overshadow everything. As she left the hall, her sisters' whispered taunts followed her. But she barely heard them. Her mind was consumed by the weight of what had just happened. She had wanted to be seen, to be valued, but not like this. And now, with Ethan's arrival imminent, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that her fragile sense of hope was about to be tested in ways she wasn't ready for. The days leading up to Ethan's arrival were a whirlwind of preparation. The palace, which had long been a cold and distant place for Ella, was suddenly alive with activity. Servants bustled about, polishing every surface until it gleamed, arranging lavish decorations, and preparing feasts fit for a king. For everyone else, it was a celebration of a potential alliance with Everdale. But for Ella, it was a storm of anxiety. Her father, King Henry, seemed almost cheerful, issuing orders and ensuring everything was perfect for the prince's visit. Queen Eleanor, on the other hand, was less enthused. Her sharp glances toward Ella and her constant whispers with Ivy and Lila were evidence enough of her displeasure. You'll ruin this, Ivy hissed one afternoon as she passed Ella in the corridor. You always do. Ella ignored her, keeping her head high. She had learned long ago that responding to her sisters only gave them more ammunition. But inside, her heart was pounding. She didn't want this spectacle, this attention. And she certainly didn't want Ethan to walk into a world that had always been so cruel to her. On the day of Ethan's arrival, Ella found herself dressed in a gown she barely recognized. It was a soft shade of green, flowing and elegant, chosen by the Queen herself. The servants had styled her hair and adorned her with delicate jewelry, transforming her into someone she barely knew. As she stared at her reflection in the mirror, she felt like an imposter. "He won't even recognize me," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the thudding of her heart. When the trumpets sounded, announcing Prince Ethan's arrival, the entire palace seemed to hold its breath. Ella stood to the side of the grand hall, hidden behind one of the massive pillars. She watched as the grand doors opened, revealing Ethan dressed in royal finery. He looked every bit the part of a prince, his posture confident and his gaze steady. But when his eyes scanned the room and landed on Ella, his face softened. He stepped forward, bowing respectfully to King Henry and Queen Eleanor before his attention returned to her. As the introductions were made, Ella felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her, her father's hopeful, calculating gaze, her mother's cold disapproval, and her sister's simmering jealousy. But none of it mattered when Ethan finally stood before her. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his voice warm and sincere. Ella's cheeks flushed, and she glanced away. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had to," he replied, his tone firm. "I meant what I said. Ella, I'm not going anywhere." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. There was a grand feast, with laughter and music filling the air. But Ella felt out of place. She could see the way her family interacted with Ethan. Their smiles forced and their questions calculated. It was clear they saw him as a means to an end. And it made her stomach churn. Ethan, however, seemed unfazed. He navigated the evening with ease, his charm disarming even the Queen's icy demeanor. But every so often, his gaze would drift to Ella, offering her a small, reassuring smile that steadied her nerves. When the festivities ended and the guests began to disperse, Ethan sought Ella out. She had retreated to one of the palace's quieter corridors, seeking refuge from the overwhelming noise and attention. He found her leaning against a window, the moonlight casting a soft glow on her face. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, stepping closer. Ella turned to him, her expression conflicted. "I don't belong here," she said quietly. "This isn't my world. Ethan, you see me. But they don't. They never have." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Then let's leave," he said simply. "Come with me. Ella. Leave all of this behind. You deserve more than this." Her heart ached at his words, the sincerity in his voice breaking through the walls she had built around herself. But the weight of her family's expectations and her own fears held her back. "It's not that easy," she said, shaking her head. "My family, they'll never let me go. They don't own you." Ethan said firmly, "You're stronger than you think. Ella, you've endured so much. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. Let me be there for you." Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned away, unable to face him. "What if I'm not enough?" she whispered. "What if you wake up one day and realize they were right?" Ethan stepped closer, his voice soft but unwavering. "You are enough. More than enough. You've shown me a kind of strength and kindness that no one else ever has. I don't care what they say. Ella, I care about you." Ella looked at him, her tears spilling over as she finally allowed herself to believe his words. For so long, she had been defined by the world's narrow expectations. But with Ethan, she felt free to be herself, to be seen for more than her appearance. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. They turned to see Ivy and Lila approaching, their faces twisted with malice. Well, Ivy sneered. "Isn't this cozy? The prince and the forgotten princess." Lila laughed, her tone sharp. "Do you really think someone like her could ever be a queen? It's pathetic. Ethan stepped in front of Ella. His posture protective. That's enough, he said coldly. His voice cutting through the air like a blade. You don't know her. You don't see her. But I do. The sisters froze. Their smug expressions faltering under the weight of Ethan's words. He turned to Ella. His gaze softening. You are everything they could never understand, he said. And I won't let anyone take that from you. Ella's heart swelled. Her tears falling freely now. For the first time. She felt truly seen. Not just by Ethan but by herself. She straightened her shoulders. Her voice steady as she finally spoke. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Her words meant for both Ethan and her sisters. Not anymore. The confrontation with Ivy and Lila was a turning point for Ella. For the first time in her life. She stood her ground. Refusing to shrink under the weight of their cruelty. Ethan's unwavering support gave her strength. And she realized that she no longer had to endure their taunts in silence. She had found a voice. One that resonated not only in her songs but in her resolve. The days following Ethan's defense of her were tense. Ivy and Lila sulked. Their humiliation a bitter pill to swallow. Queen Eleanor watched Ella with a mix of suspicion and disdain. While King Henry seemed to grow more interested in her newfound connection to Prince Ethan. It was a strange and unsettling shift. Being acknowledged after years of neglect. But Ella couldn't shake the feeling that her father's attention was less about her and more about what she represented. Ethan remained at the palace. His presence a constant source of comfort for Ella. They continued to meet in quiet corners. Away from prying eyes. Their bond deepening with each passing moment. He listened to her fears and doubts. Countering them with words of encouragement and unwavering belief in her. And slowly, Ella began to believe in herself. One evening, as the palace settled into an uneasy quiet, Ethan found Ella in the gardens. She was sitting beneath a sprawling willow tree, her hands folded in her lap and her gaze fixed on the stars above. The moonlight bathed her in a soft glow, and Ethan felt his breath catch at the sight of her. Mind if I join you? He asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Ella turned, a small smile playing on her lips. Of course. He sat beside her, the cool grass brushing against their hands as they settled into a comfortable silence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the day hanging between them. They'll never accept me, Ella said finally, her voice quiet but steady. No matter what you say, no matter what you see. They'll always see me as less. Even if I wanted to leave with you, they'd find a way to ruin it. Ethan shook his head, his jaw tightening. They don't have that power over you. Ella. Not anymore. You don't know them like I do, she replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. My mother, my sisters, they've spent my entire life reminding me that I don't belong. And they're wrong. Ethan said firmly. He turned to face her. His gaze intense. You belong more than anyone I've ever met. You have a strength they could never understand. And it terrifies them. That's why they try to tear you down, because they see what I see. Even if they won't admit it. Ella looked at him, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. She wanted to believe him. To trust in the future he painted for her. But years of rejection had left scars that weren't easily healed. Why me? She whispered. You could have anyone. Ethan. Why choose me? Ethan's expression softened. And he reached for her hand. His touch warm and steady. Because you're real, he said. You've faced so much. But you haven't let it break you. You see the world differently. Ella. You see beauty where others see flaws. And your voice, he smiled. Shaking his head. Your voice is like nothing I've ever heard. It's a gift. Ella. You're a gift. Tears spilled down her cheeks. And she quickly wiped them away. I don't feel like a gift, she said softly. Most of the time, I feel like a mistake. You're not. Ethan said. His voice unwavering. You're a miracle. Ella let out a shaky laugh. The weight of his words settling into her heart. For so long. She had believed the narrative her family had created for her, one of unworthiness and insignificance. But here was Ethan, rewriting that story with every word he spoke. They sat together beneath the willow tree, the stars above them twinkling like scattered diamonds. The world felt smaller, quieter, as if it belonged to them alone. And for the first time, Ella allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the palace, beyond the walls that had confined her. But their peace was short-lived. The next morning, chaos erupted in the palace. Ivy and Lila, desperate to regain their footing, had spread rumors about Ella's meetings with Ethan. Whispers of impropriety and scandal swept through the halls, fueled by the Queen's icy disapproval. Ella tried to stay out of sight, but the weight of the rumors pressed heavily on her. She knew her family would never stop trying to undermine her, and the thought of Ethan being dragged into their schemes filled her with dread. Ethan, however, was undeterred. He confronted King Henry directly, his voice firm as he defended Ella's honor. "I see her for who she is," he said. "She is kind, strong, and extraordinary. If you cannot see her worth, that is your failing, not hers." The king was taken aback by Ethan's conviction, but it was clear that the prince's words carried weight. For the first time, Ella saw a flicker of doubt in her father's eyes, a crack in the cold, unyielding exterior he had always worn. As the rumors swirled and tensions rose, Ella realized that she couldn't stay silent any longer. She had spent her life hiding. But now, with Ethan by her side, she knew it was time to step into the light. That evening, as the palace buzzed with whispers and speculation, Ella stood in the great hall, her voice steady as she addressed the gathered crowd. "I am Ella," she said, her words ringing out clear and strong. "I have spent my life being overlooked, dismissed, and judged. But I will not let your whispers define me. I am more than what you see." Ethan stood beside her, his presence a steady reassurance. And for the first time, Ella felt the weight of her own strength, the power of her voice carrying through the room. She had found her place, not in the shadows, but in the light. Ella's voice carried through the grand hall, a beacon of quiet defiance that silenced the gathered crowd. For years, she had been an afterthought in her own home, a figure that faded into the background while others claimed the spotlight. But tonight, as she stood before her family and the nobles of the court, she was no longer invisible. "I have endured your whispers and your judgment," Ella continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I have been called less, treated as though I didn't belong. But I do belong. Not because of my title or my lineage, but because of who I am." The silence in the room was deafening. Ivy and Lila stood near the back, their faces pale with shock. Queen Eleanor's expression was unreadable, her hands clenching the arms of her chair. King Henry looked as though he didn't know whether to feel pride or discomfort. Ella turned to Ethan, drawing strength from his steady presence. He gave her a small nod, his eyes filled with admiration. Taking a deep breath, she faced her family once more. "I will no longer let your perception of me dictate my worth," she said. "I am more than what you see, and I will no longer hide in the shadows to make you comfortable." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, the weight of her words settling on those gathered. For the first time, Ella saw uncertainty in the faces of the people who had always dismissed her. The nobles, the servants, even her family seemed to hesitate, as though reconsidering everything they thought they knew about her. King Henry rose from his seat, his expression a mixture of curiosity and regret. "Ella," he said, his voice hesitant, "you've shown a strength I never expected. Perhaps I was wrong to overlook you." Ella met his gaze, her heart aching with a complicated mix of emotions. For years, she had longed for his acknowledgement, his love. But now, standing before him, she realized that she no longer needed his validation. "I don't need your approval, Father," she said gently but firmly. "I only needed to find my own." The king seemed taken aback, his mouth opening as if to speak. But no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken, until Ethan stepped forward. Ella's courage is a reflection of who she's always been, Ethan said, his voice calm but commanding. She doesn't need anyone to see her worth because it's always been there. But if you are willing to see her for who she truly is, you may find that she is more than any of us deserve. The crowd murmured again, the tension in the room slowly beginning to ease. Queen Eleanor's sharp gaze softened, just slightly, and Ivy and Lila exchanged uneasy glances. Ella felt a weight lift from her chest, a freedom she had never known. She had spent so long trying to fit into a mold she was never meant to fill. But now, she stood as herself, unapologetic, strong, and unyielding. When the gathering finally dispersed, the hall fell quiet. Ethan stayed by Ella's side as the last of the guests filed out, their expressions a mixture of awe and uncertainty. King Henry lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but he eventually followed Queen Eleanor, leaving Ella and Ethan alone. "You were incredible," Ethan said, his voice filled with pride. Ella turned to him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I don't think I've ever been that terrified. But you did it anyway," Ethan said, reaching for her hand. "That's what makes you remarkable." Ella looked down at their entwined hands, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you. You didn't need me," Ethan said softly. "You've always had this strength." "Ella, I just reminded you it was there." Tears welled in her eyes. But they weren't tears of sorrow or pain. For the first time, they were tears of release, of joy. She felt lighter, as though the years of rejection and self-doubt had finally fallen away. Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Come with me to Everdale. Let me show you a life where you're not just tolerated but celebrated. You don't have to stay here. Ella, you deserve so much more." Ella hesitated, the thought of leaving both exhilarating and terrifying. She glanced around the empty hall, the weight of her past lingering like a shadow. But when she looked back at Ethan, she saw the promise of something new, something beautiful. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll go with you." Ethan's smile was radiant, his relief palpable. He pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly as though afraid she might change her mind. As they parted, Ella felt a sense of peace settle over her. For the first time, she was choosing her own path, one not defined by the expectations of others. She was choosing love, freedom, and a future she had never dared to imagine. The next morning, as the sun rose over the palace, Ella and Ethan prepared to leave. Her sisters watched from a distance, their expressions a mix of jealousy and regret. Queen Eleanor said nothing, her cold demeanor unbroken. But King Henry approached Ella before she mounted her horse. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said quietly. Ella met his gaze, her expression kind but resolute. "I already have." As they rode away from the palace, the wind rushing past them, Ella felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The forest gave way to open fields, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. And for the first time, Ella allowed herself to dream of all that lay ahead. She had found her voice, her strength, and her worth. And as Ethan rode beside her, his presence a steady reassurance, she knew that she had also found something she never thought possible: love. Ella's journey had been one of transformation, of finding her voice, her strength, and the courage to embrace who she truly was. As she rode alongside Ethan toward Everdale, she felt a peace she had never known. The years of judgment and rejection were behind her, replaced by a future filled with love and acceptance. Ethan had seen in her what no one else had: the beauty of her soul, the kindness in her heart, and the strength in her spirit. Together, they faced the horizon, their path no longer clouded by doubt but illuminated with hope. Ella's story was more than one of love, it was a testament to resilience and the power of believing in oneself. If you enjoyed this heartfelt tale, Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring narratives. Ring the bell to never miss an update. And share the magic of storytelling with your friend.